What does the Roman Empire have to do with us? Not the famous question from Monty Python's Life of Brian, what has the Roman Empire ever done for us? To which the answer is things like roads and aqueducts and sanitation, but a question which you may have been left with after the sermon last week. Because in that sermon, I made a cardinal error. I used a code word, a word of jargon, without properly explaining it. And that jargon word was empire. It's a word to which I have been exposed quite a lot in recent years in church circles. It's used a great deal in the discussions that go on within the World Communion of Reformed Churches. And it's taken me a long time to understand it as a theological as opposed to a political term. It's a term that I've resisted for a long time, largely, I suppose, because I wasn't understanding it in the way that other people were using it. Like, I suppose, many of us, I was educated to think of empire as, on balance, quite a good thing. I remember in, I suppose, primary 4, asking the teacher why the map on the world map on the classroom wall had so much of it coloured in pink. You'll probably remember maps like that yourselves. And I was told, well, these are the countries of the British Empire. Now, bearing in mind that this was sometime in the 1970s, it will give you the impression that my school was rather old-fashioned, the British Empire not really being in existence by then. Also at school, they tried to teach me Latin, I'm afraid not terribly successfully, but we learnt about the Roman Empire and its benefits, the roads, the sanitation, the underfloor heating, and we saw these things on visits to Hadrian's Wall. But empire, as something benign, is only one view. And it has never been the view of those, the majority of those who have been colonized. While the Roman Empire forms the historical context to the life of Jesus from birth to death, empire as a concept, not the specific empires of any country or time or place, but empire as a concept forms the living context of all faithful Christian living and discipleship. Christ lives in us, and we live in the context of empire. So what do I mean by empire as a theological concept? I mean a system which uses violence to achieve political ends, which creates hierarchies based on things like race and on ideas about some people being deserving and others undeserving. I mean a system which prioritizes the wealth of elites over the welfare of the many. A system which views the people of one place as inherently superior and deserving of benefit, and the people of other places as inherently inferior and ripe for exploitation. Reading from Luke's Gospel last week, we saw how Jesus was born into the context of empire, specifically the Roman Empire. And we heard about how Luke asserts that his birth and his life was a direct challenge to all that empire stands for. Today we are reading from Matthew's Gospel. He has the same message, but he tells it in quite a different way. He is also telling a subversive story. A story about someone he believed was born to challenge and defeat empire and to inaugurate the reign of God. Empire rules by violence and coercion. God reigns by love and justice and by consent. God does not impose God's will in the way that empire imposes its will. For God to reign, we need to choose to accept the rule of God. And that means that we have to choose to resist the violence and the coercion of empire. It's not easy. But Jesus is our light and our guide. And Jesus is with us. You'll remember that Luke dedicated his gospel to somebody called Theophilus, which means in Greek, one who loves God. And it may be that we feel the dedication is really for us all. But what's important about that is that Luke was writing for somebody whose thinking was formed by Greek ways of thinking. Matthew, though, has a different readership in mind. He was writing for Jewish readers, and that shapes the stories he creates. The central premise of his gospel is that Jesus is the new Moses, who gives the new law and ultimately leads all God's people out of bondage and slavery into freedom. Matthew's stories of Jesus' birth lay out as a parable this core message. So Matthew roots his story of Jesus in the Old Testament, and in particular in the stories of Moses. The first person that Luke mentions in chapter 2 of his gospel is Caesar Augustus. And by quite a neat coincidence, the first person that Matthew mentions in his chapter 2 is King Herod, the puppet king placed on his throne by Rome in order to keep order on behalf of the empire. It is Herod who drives the plot in this chapter. First, certain strangers arrive in Jerusalem. Matthew doesn't tell us how many there were, nor does he say that they were kings. These characters are magi, religious leaders from another faith, people with mysterious wisdom. But most importantly, they are Gentiles, non-Jews, but people who, in their wisdom and spirituality, recognize the lordship of Christ. Looking for the true King of the Jews, they start to ask around in Jerusalem, where will we find him? This causes a stir. Everybody else in Jerusalem knew that Herod claimed the title King of the Jews. He wouldn't take kindly to any rival. And nobody liked when Herod got angry. Unstable despots are never a good thing. Herod summons the Magi to appear before him, and he tries to lay a trap. He sends them to find the Christ and then report back. His promise of personal homage is false. Empire pays lip service to Christ, but actually seeks to destroy him. The Magi go their way, they find Jesus, they give their gifts and their adoration, and after being warned in a dream of Herod's evil intent, they go home by another route. Foiled, Herod explodes in anger, and he orders the death of all the boys aged 2 or under in Bethlehem to try to wipe out this perceived threat. Now, if you were a Jewish reader, steeped in the scriptures of the Old Testament, you'd instantly be saying, I've heard something like this before. And the story that you would be thinking about is the story of the infant Moses. For what did Pharaoh do? He ordered the murder of all the Hebrew baby boys. And what happened to Moses, a Hebrew baby boy? He was miraculously preserved by Pharaoh's own daughter and brought up in Pharaoh's own court. So Herod is cast by Matthew as the new Pharaoh, the enemy of God's people. And that makes Jesus the new Moses, the Savior, miraculously preserved in infancy, taking refuge in Egypt before returning once the danger had more or less passed. What does all this say? Amid bondage, oppression, violence, brutality, and tyranny, God is clearly at work. It was true at the time of Moses. It was true at the time of Jesus' birth. It's true now. And it's true for all time. Amid the darkness of empire, God is shining a light, and that light is Christ. Matthew makes that point with one of the most memorable images from his story, the image of the star observed by the Magi. It's not an astronomical phenomenon, and I think it's probably idle to try to identify it as such. What it is a symbol of the light of Christ, a symbol of the light of truth, of the light of God's love, which draws uneducated shepherds and learned mystics alike to Jesus. Its message is this: Jesus was born into a dark world, darkness which is still all too recognizable. And from Matthew we learn that the powers of the world too often choose the ways of darkness, the ways of evil, the ways of violence and destruction. But Jesus is light in the darkness. The empires of the world and their Herods will always try to extinguish the light. But will they succeed? Never. The light of Christ will always be shining. Amen.